Big Shaq walks into an elite jewelry store to pick up his one-of-a-kind timepiece, only to be accused of stealing it in front of the world. But this isn't about a watch. It's about power, control, and a hidden enemy pulling the strings. As his empire hangs in the balance, Shaq must outplay his rivals, expose the conspiracy, and flip the game before it's too late. Because in a war of reputation, the truth isn't enough. Only domination guarantees survival. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel and tell us where are you watching from? Share in the comments below. The scent of polished mahogany and expensive cologne filled the air as Big Shaq stepped into Vanguard Jewelers, one of the most prestigious luxury watch retailers in New York City. Every surface gleamed under soft, strategically placed lighting, reflecting the exclusivity of a store that catered to only the world's wealthiest elite. Shaq moved with purpose, his tailored black suit fitting his frame perfectly, exuding quiet power. He wasn't just a billionaire entrepreneur. He was a man who never lost control. And today was no different. He had come for one reason, to collect his custom-commissioned timepiece, a one-of-a-kind Vanguard Orion, designed exclusively for him. Handcrafted in Switzerland, encrusted with rare blue sapphires, the watch wasn't just an accessory. It was a statement. A uniformed sales associate, a man in his late 30s with neatly combed brown hair, immediately straightened at the sight of Shaq. His expression was polite, but his posture was too stiff, his smile too rehearsed. "Mr. Hunter," the man greeted, voice smooth but lacking the warmth usually reserved for high-profile clients. "We've been expecting you." Shaq arched a brow but said nothing. He was escorted to a private VIP lounge within the store, a sleek, glass-walled room with velvet seating and a single display case sitting on a polished marble pedestal. Inside the case, resting on a black silk cushion, was the Vanguard Orion. Perfection. The moment the case was unlocked, Shaq reached for the watch, feeling its familiar weight in his hands. The cool platinum, the smooth sapphire face, exactly as he had ordered. No need for small talk, no need for hesitation. He slid the watch onto his wrist, admiring the flawless craftsmanship. Then, with his usual efficiency, he turned and headed toward the exit. And that's when it happened. The moment he stepped past the invisible security barrier, a piercing alarm shattered the silence. Every head in the store turned. Shaq froze. A fraction of a second later, two security guards appeared from nowhere, moving swiftly, cutting off his path to the door. The air shifted. Something wasn't right. Shaq didn't react immediately. He didn't need to. Years of navigating high-stakes negotiations had trained him to recognize when a power play was unfolding. And right now, he was in the middle of one. Behind the guards, a man in an impeccably tailored navy blue suit emerged from the inner offices. His silver cufflinks glinted under the store lights as he approached with an air of controlled authority. Grayson Holt, store manager. A man who had built a reputation for discretion. The kind of person who handled transactions worth millions without ever flinching. But as he stopped a few feet from Shaq, his expression was unreadable. "Mr. Hunter," Holt said smoothly, hands clasped behind his back. "I'm afraid we have a problem." Shaq tilted his head slightly, his calm, controlled gaze never wavering. "Do we?" Holt didn't blink. "Yes, that watch on your wrist hasn't been paid for." Silence. A long, charged pause filled the space between them. Shaq's eyes narrowed, his mind processing 1,000 calculations at once. The watch hadn't been paid for? Impossible. His assistant had wired the full payment weeks ago. The order had been confirmed. His team had double-checked every detail. This wasn't a mistake. This was intentional. "Try again," Shaq said, his voice steady, but edged with quiet warning. Holt exhaled, as if regretful. "I wish I could. But according to our system, the funds for that purchase were reversed. The watch remains property of Vanguard Jewelers." Shaq's jaw tensed just slightly, a flicker of irritation flashing behind his sharp gaze. "You're saying I stole my own watch?" Holt's silence was answer enough. The guards remained in place, their stance unwavering. The store's entire staff seemed frozen, watching the situation unfold. Some with nervous expressions, others with deliberate neutrality, as if they had been prepped for this moment. Shaq's heartbeat remained steady, but inside, the calculation shifted. This wasn't just a misunderstanding. It was a move. But whose? The people in the store weren't acting like this was some random incident. The guards weren't confused. They were waiting. The employees weren't shocked. They were watching. And Holt? Holt was too calm, too prepared. Shaq could feel it in his gut. This wasn't about a watch. This was about him. A lesser man would have demanded proof, raised his voice, called his lawyer. Shaq did none of those things. Instead, he took a slow step forward, and even though the guards didn't move, the tension in the air spiked. "Holt," Shaq said, voice dangerously smooth. "You've been in this business a long time. Long enough to know when someone's pulling a stunt." Holt didn't flinch. "I only follow store policy." Shaq let the silence stretch, watching Holt. Watching the minute twitch in his jaw, the slight shift in his stance. He was lying. But more than that, he was stalling. Why? Shaq's instincts sharpened. There was something bigger at play here, something behind the scenes. And the way Holt was acting? He wasn't in control. Someone else was pulling the strings. The question was, who? And why? Shaq's phone buzzed in his pocket, but he didn't need to check it to know who it was. His assistant, his team, his people already moving. Because if someone thought they could box him into a corner, turn him into a pawn in their game, they had no idea who they were dealing with. Shaq exhaled once, then offered a slow, knowing smirk. They wanted him to react, to lose control. So instead, he stepped back and let the game begin. The tension in the room thickened like a slow-moving storm, silent but electric, charged with an unspoken threat that hung in the air between Big Shaq and Grayson Holt. The jewelry store's opulent surroundings, with its gleaming marble floors and soft ambient lighting, no longer felt like a place of luxury. It felt like a stage. And Shaq was the main act in a performance he never agreed to join. Holt stood just a few feet away, perfectly composed, immaculately dressed, the kind of man who exuded confidence not because he was powerful, but because he had been given power, by someone else. His navy blue suit was crisp, tailored to perfection, his silver cufflinks gleaming under the light as he adjusted his sleeve with slow, deliberate movements. He wasn't nervous. That was the most telling part. Shaq kept his posture relaxed, but his mind was already working at a relentless pace, calculating, analyzing, peeling back the layers of this setup. His legal team was already moving, making calls, pulling transaction records. Yet Holt didn't seem concerned, and that alone told Shaq one undeniable truth. This wasn't about the watch. This was about him. Holt clasped his hands behind his back, his voice smooth, measured. "Mr. Hunter, I understand your frustration. But the fact remains. Our records show that this watch was never fully paid for. The funds were reversed, and as of now, it belongs to Vanguard Jewelers." Shaq met Holt's gaze with unwavering intensity, his expression unreadable. "And yet, somehow, you didn't mention that before I walked in here, before I put it on my wrist and made my exit. Convenient, don't you think?" A flicker of something crossed Holt's face. Not fear, but recognition. He knew Shaq wasn't going to be an easy target. That only made this more interesting. Security remained stationed by the exit, their presence a silent warning. They weren't moving toward him, but they weren't stepping aside either. A blockade, not an enforcement. The entire store was still. Employees were pretending to busy themselves, but Shaq could feel their stolen glances, the quiet tension in their movements. They weren't just witnessing an incident, they were watching something orchestrated. Then came the sound. A distant shuffle, followed by the faintest hum of voices outside. Shaq didn't need to turn around to know what was happening. The media was here. Holt tilted his head slightly, as if he had just confirmed a checkmate move. "This is an unfortunate situation, Mr. Hunter, but it doesn't have to escalate. If we could settle this quietly, I'm sure we can avoid unnecessary attention." Shaq let a slow smirk cross his lips, the first real expression he had shown since this began. "Unnecessary attention?" He gestured vaguely toward the entrance. "You made sure they were here before I even walked in, Holt. Don't insult my intelligence." For the first time, The store manager's mask cracked. Not much, just a fraction of a second. A single misstep in an otherwise flawless act. Shaq had him. The tension in the room thickened like a slow-moving storm, silent but electric, charged with an unspoken threat that hung in the air between Big Shaq and Grayson Holt. The jewelry store's opulent surroundings, with its gleaming marble floors and soft ambient lighting, no longer felt like a place of luxury. It felt like a stage, and Shaq was the main act in a performance he never agreed to join. Holt stood just a few feet away, perfectly composed, immaculately dressed, the kind of man who exuded confidence not because he was powerful, but because he had been given power by someone else. His navy blue suit was crisp, tailored to perfection, his silver cufflinks gleaming under the light as he adjusted his sleeve with slow, deliberate movements. He wasn't nervous. That was the most telling part. Shaq kept his posture relaxed, but his mind was already working at a relentless pace, calculating, analyzing, peeling back the layers of this setup. His legal team was already moving, making calls, pulling transaction records. Yet Holt didn't seem concerned, and that alone told Shaq one undeniable truth. This wasn't about the watch. This was about him. Holt clasped his hands behind his back, his voice smooth, measured. "Mr. Hunter, I understand your frustration, but the fact remains, our records show that this watch was never fully paid for. The funds were reversed, and as of now, it belongs to Vanguard Jewelers." Shaq met Holt's gaze with unwavering intensity, his expression unreadable. "And yet somehow you didn't mention that before I walked in here, before I put it on my wrist and made my exit. Convenient, don't you think?" A flicker of something crossed Holt's face. Not fear, but recognition. He knew Shaq wasn't going to be an easy target. That only made this more interesting. Security remained stationed by the exit, their presence a silent warning. They weren't moving toward him, but they weren't stepping aside either. A blockade, not an enforcement. The entire store was still. Employees were pretending to busy themselves, but Shaq could feel their stolen glances, the quiet tension in their movements. They weren't just witnessing an incident. They were watching something orchestrated. Then came the sound. A distant shuffle, followed by the faintest hum of voices outside. Shaq didn't need to turn around to know what was happening. The media was here. Holt tilted his head slightly, as if he had just confirmed a checkmate move. "This is an unfortunate situation, Mr. Hunter, but it doesn't have to escalate. If we could settle this quietly, I'm sure we can avoid unnecessary attention." Shaq let a slow smirk cross his lips, the first real expression he had shown since this began. "Unnecessary attention?" He gestured vaguely toward the entrance. "You made sure they were here before I even walked in, Holt. Don't insult my intelligence." For the first time, the store manager's mask cracked. Not much, just a fraction of a second, a single misstep in an otherwise flawless act. Shaq had him. This wasn't just a misunderstanding, not even a power move to force some ridiculous settlement out of him. This was about spectacle, public humiliation, a controlled takedown. But the question still remained. Who was really pulling the strings? Shaq's phone buzzed in his pocket, and he knew without looking that his legal team was already in play. He didn't need to check his messages to know what they would say. His transaction records were solid. The money had gone through, which meant someone had manually reversed it. A slow, simmering heat settled deep in Shaq's chest. Not anger, but something far more dangerous. Certainty. He turned back to Holt, who was waiting, still composed, still measured. "You think you're in control of this?" Shaq said, voice low, steady. "You think because you have cameras, because you have security, because you have the media waiting outside for a headline, you've won." He stepped forward just slightly, just enough to make Holt shift his weight, a microsecond of discomfort. Shaq caught it, stored it away. Another weakness. "I don't need to be in control," Holt replied coolly. "I just need to follow the facts. And the fact is, that watch doesn't belong to you." Shaq exhaled slowly, letting the moment settle. "You know what's funny about facts, Holt? They have a way of changing when the wrong people start looking into them." For a split second, there it was, the briefest flicker of uncertainty in Holt's otherwise controlled expression. Shaq tilted his head slightly, as if considering something. Then, with deliberate slowness, he pulled out his phone, tapped the screen, and placed it face up on the nearest glass counter. On the screen, a live security feed played. Vanguard Jewelers' private transaction logs. Shaq didn't need to say a word. The tension in the air shifted, cracked, deepened. Holt's expression hardened, but his shoulders stiffened just slightly. The first real sign of a man who was feeling his grip loosen. "You had this set up before I even walked in here," Shaq continued, voice even. "And whoever's backing you thought they were smart enough to cover their tracks. But you know what's even smarter?" He gestured to the screen. "Having a team that knows how to find the things you tried to erase." Silence. A silence so thick, so charged, it felt like the room itself was holding its breath. Holt swallowed, barely perceptible, but Shaq saw it. "You don't want to do this," Holt said finally, his voice quieter now, controlled but missing that previous arrogance. "You don't want to make enemies you can't see." Shaq let the words settle, weighing them, dissecting them. Holt wasn't speaking for himself anymore. He was speaking for someone else. And that someone had just made a mistake. Shaq reached for his phone, sliding it back into his pocket. Then, with a slow, measured movement, he unfastened the watch from his wrist and set it down on the counter between them. "I don't need this," Shaq said simply. "Not because I can't afford it, not because I think you're right, but because I want you to know I don't play by your rules." The store was dead silent, employees frozen, security still in place. But the power in the room, it had shifted. Holt opened his mouth, but before he could speak, Shaq took a slow step back. "We're done here," he said calmly. Then, after a beat, a final nail in the coffin, a slow smirk that held nothing but certainty. "For now." Then, without another word, Shaq turned and walked away. Holt didn't call after him, didn't stop him, didn't dare, because this wasn't over. It had just begun. The car ride away from Vanguard Jewelers was silent, but not the kind that brought peace. It was the kind of silence that carried weight, the kind that filled a room after an explosion before the dust had even settled. Shaq sat in the back of his blacked-out Maybach, staring out at the blurred city lights, his mind moving at a relentless speed. Everything about the situation reeked of orchestration. This wasn't an impulsive mistake. This was designed. Grayson Holt had played his part well, calm, composed, and disturbingly confident. Too confident. The way he had smirked, the way he had stalled, the way he had delivered that final line. "Some things are bigger than money, Mr. Hunter." It wasn't just arrogance, it was a message. But from whom? The phone in Shaq's hand vibrated. He didn't even glance at the screen before answering. Jackson Carter, his assistant and the man responsible for ensuring nothing like this should ever happen to him, was already speaking before Shaq could say a word. They scrubbed the transaction logs. That's why Holt was so smug. Jackson's voice was clipped, urgent, the sound of someone working multiple angles at once. "They made it look like you never paid for the watch, but that's not even the worst part." Shaq's grip on the phone tightened slightly. "Go on." "The refund wasn't random. A third-party account wired money to Vanguard Jewelers this morning, covering the returned purchase." Jackson's keyboard clattered in the background as he spoke. "They made it look like you changed your mind about the watch. But it was never about the watch, Shaq." Shaq exhaled slowly, leaning his head back against the leather seat, processing. Someone had gone out of their way not just to accuse him of theft, but to make it look like he had orchestrated it himself. This wasn't about money. This was about something bigger: credibility, power, reputation. "Who owns the account?" Shaq asked, his tone flat, controlled. Jackson let out a humorless chuckle. "Now, that's where it gets fun. The account is registered to a shell corporation out of the Cayman Islands. No real name, no paper trail. But here's the thing. Whoever's behind it, they have access to some serious financial back channels. You don't just fake a wire transfer that cleanly without influence." Shaq's fingers tapped against the armrest of his seat. Slow, deliberate. Influence. That meant someone at a high level had moved these pieces. A competitor? A government entity? Someone from his past? The who mattered less than the why at this moment. Shaq closed his eyes for a second, visualizing the pieces on the board. Vanguard Jewelers wasn't the target. The watch wasn't the target. He was. And this wasn't about today. Whoever had done this wasn't just trying to land a headline scandal. They were laying the foundation for something bigger. "Jackson," Shaq said, voice calm but firm, "I want you to find the first ripple. Every move leaves a shadow, no matter how well they cover their tracks. Find the connection between that shell account and someone real." Jackson hesitated. That might take time. Shaq opened his eyes, looking out at the city passing by in a blur of neon lights. "You have 24 hours. A pause. Then Jackson exhaled. "I'll call you when I have something." The line went dead. Shaq tossed his phone onto the seat beside him and stared out the window. He had spent years building his reputation, carefully crafting the kind of empire that couldn't be touched. He knew how to play the game better than most, knew how to control narratives before they controlled him. Whoever was coming for him now, they were playing for something bigger than just humiliation. The next morning, Shaq sat in his private office, a sleek, glass-walled space that overlooked the New York skyline, sipping black coffee as the pieces of the puzzle began shifting into place. The room was quiet, except for the faint hum of the city below, but his mind was anything but. Jackson walked in, carrying a tablet, his expression tight. "I found the first ripple," he said, setting the tablet on Shaq's desk. Shaq took it without a word, his eyes scanning the screen. The data in front of him was clean, too clean, except for one overlooked detail. The shell company that had refunded the money to Vanguard Jewelers? It was linked to a financial firm, Sterling Global Holdings. Shaq set the tablet down, his fingers steepled. Sterling Global. That name wasn't just familiar, it was personal. 12 months ago, Shaq had single-handedly outmaneuvered Sterling Global in a high-profile acquisition deal, a corporate takeover that left their CEO, Vincent Holloway, humiliated and desperate for a win. Was this revenge? Shaq's instincts said no. Holloway had resources, but he wasn't the kind of man to play long, strategic games. He was reactionary, emotional. This move? It was surgical, precise. Someone else was using Sterling Global as a front. Jackson watched him carefully. "What's the move?" Shaq leaned back in his chair, letting out a slow breath. "We make them think they're winning." Jackson raised an eyebrow. "How do we do that?" Shaq's lips curled into a faint smirk.